I would like to tell you the story of my life. I was a 25-year-old man when I became a vampire, and the year was 1791. We were living in Louisiana then. We'd received a land grant and settled 2 indigo plantations on the Mississippi, very near New Orleans. Our life there was both luxurious and primitive. There was no city in America like New Orleans, a city in which a vampire, richly dressed, might attract no more notice in the evening than hundreds of other exotic creatures, if he attracted any attention at all. If anyone stopped to whisper behind a fan, "That man, how pale, how he gleams, how he moves, it's not natural." A city in which a vampire might be gone before the words had even passed the lips.
Well, I was born in New Orleans in 1941, and I was named Howard. I was the second, and my mother and father really felt that Howard was going to be a great name of distinction for me. They felt that it was going to bring me extraordinary good fortune. So they named me Howard Allen O'Brien, and I was baptized in St. Alphonsus Church in New Orleans. It was the first day of school, and I didn't want to be called Howard in front of the other children. I didn't want people staring at me. And my mother took me up to Sister Hyacinth, and she said, "This is my daughter," and I said my name was Ann. My mother looked at me and she said, "Well, if she wants her name to be Ann, let her name be Ann."
My vampire nature has been for me the greatest adventure of my life. All that went before it was confused, clouded. I went through mortal life like a blind man groping from solid object to solid object. It was only when I became a vampire that I respected for the first time all of life. I never saw a living, pulsing human being until I was a vampire. I never knew what life was until it ran out in a red gush over my lips, my hands.
Down here in South Louisiana, every time they got a full moon, we got a monster that comes out. That monster's called a rougarou. Now, the rougarou can be anybody. But if he lives in a house, well, he's gonna leave the house and walk away because he don't want to bite his own people. The rougarou goes out, he has to have blood. So he finds somebody and he bites him to suck the blood. Now, sometimes the ones he bites, they die. But if they live, then they become a rougarou too.
Well, I know when I had this dream, I was about 4 years old, and it concerned this area back the street from our house, which was sort of a dark, kind of gloomy area. There were a couple of old houses back there that weren't painted, and I remember there was one house where an old lady lived who had only oil lamps, which I thought was very frightening. She had no electricity. And in the dream, for some reason, I was wandering back there, maybe trying to get home, I'm not sure. And up the street from my house came this woman walking with a prayer book in her hands, and she appeared to be made of complete white marble. And I remember asking, is that my grandmother? And someone in the dream said, no, that's somebody from previous generations who was walking in our time. We lived right on the edge of the Garden District, which I think is one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the world, really. And it's filled with very, very large houses, which are fairly crowded together on small lots that have very, very well-developed gardens. And I grew up wandering through the neighborhood, loving those houses, really. They had a profound impression on my imagination. They had a profound impression on my personality. Well, many of these houses are haunted, and there are hair-raising stories about the ghosts in them. I can't keep all the ghosts straight, and I have a way of forgetting which ghost lives where, but there are stories everywhere.
Lord, New Orleans is full of ghost stories. The people I grew up with, I remember someone saying that to the Irish, the other world is not under the earth or above the earth, the other world is right beside you. And and Ann and I grew up with the other world right beside us. And, everyone believed in ghosts.
During the middle of the last century, a young Irish girl took a job as a domestic in a house and was later taken as mistress by the owner. She bore him an illegitimate child whom he promised to adopt. When it came time to baptize the child, however, he reneged on his promise, whereupon the young Irish girl went insane, was confined to a mental institution, and took her own life. But the child she bore disappeared. Rumor has it that the owner of the home killed the child and buried its body within the walls. Though the house has undergone renovation on numerous occasions, there is a stain on one wall that refuses to leave, no matter how many times it's been painted over a wallpaper. You can usually tell a home that's haunted by the way it looks, if its architecture is just not right or out of kilter. The spirits simply refuse to leave.
There are many spirit entities in houses and dwellings in the city of New Orleans. Many people have seen the entities, and many people have felt the presence of the entities. I'm Thomas Clark. I'm a parapsychologist. I have felt and seen both. This is the Upper Pentava building, one of the oldest apartment buildings in the United States. I'm a resident here. There are many spirit entities here, and usually a spirit entity is earthbound due to an unresolved event within their life structure. I was going from my bedroom into the kitchen, and I felt like I was in a crowded dance floor and formal attire. And there was a lot of ectoplasm, a lot of foggy mist, and it was very exciting, and I just walked through.
I remember being very, very little and trying to grasp what I was being told about what was going to happen to us after death. Everyone said that there would be Judgment Day at the end of the world. And somehow I got the idea that we would have to lie in our graves until Judgment Day, and that it was going to be horribly boring, that we would just lie there in these boxes, you know, and we'd be trapped in our bodies and we wouldn't be able to get out. And that was a notion that I was never able to lose.
This is Lafayette Cemetery. Ann and I used to play in the cemetery. You can see the graves are very close together. And it made a marvelous place just to run and hide. You could jump out and scare the bejesus out of anybody who was walking through here at the time. They found out, though, after they built these tombs, that during the epidemics, when they would bury someone in it, it was before the times of embalming. So they took to crossing the hands in the coffins like so, and tying a bell to the inside of it. This was in case they interred anyone by mistake who was actually in a coma.
Well, we lived at 2301 St. Charles. It's right on the corner of St. Charles Avenue, which is one of the busiest streets in New Orleans. My earliest years, of course, were years alone with my mother. My father was away in the war, and I remember a sort of idyllic time, really, with just a house of women. My mother taught us prayers. She was very, very deeply religious. She had long, dark hair and very large eyes. She had a very expressive face and a beautiful voice, and she was the finest storyteller of anybody that I've ever known. And I remember once we were passing this house on St. Charles Avenue, and she said, that house is haunted. A very strange thing happened there. And I said, well, what was it? And she said, there was a beautiful woman, and she was sitting in the front room at her dressing table, and she was brushing her hair, and suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, her hair burst into flame. I remember being horrified, just absolutely horrified.
We were raised very permissively, and we were allowed to do pretty much what we wanted. And we were allowed to ride our tricycles and our scooters all up and down the hall of the house. And we did cartwheels around the living room floor. We drew on the walls if we wanted to with crayons.
She had some very strong ideas about rearing 4 geniuses. That's what she wanted us to be, and she would even remind us that behind every great person is a great mother. To remember her when we became great people. This is the first place I ever lived. It's incredible to be back here. Oh, just incredible. And here's the living room that seemed so huge to me when I was a child. This was my mother's room. And her bed was right here, and there was a little gas heater there. There was the mantle there, you can still see. And boy, this is amazing. It feels exactly the same.
She was afraid of the dark. Sometimes I would stay up with her at night because she was afraid to be alone. She was afraid of rats and mice, of which there are plenty in New Orleans. She was a very frightened person.
He came in from the courtyard, opening the French doors without a sound. A tall, fair-skinned man with a mass of blonde hair and a graceful, almost feline quality to his movements. He stepped close to my bed and leaned down so that his face was in the lamplight, and I saw that he was no ordinary man at all. His grey eyes burned with an incandescence, and the long white hands which hung by his sides were not those of a human being. I think I knew everything in that instant. I forgot myself totally.
When the rougarou gets somebody, he bites him in the neck. He's big and strong, so he can force him down. He bites him in the neck, and he sucks the blood out of the big jugular veins. When he sucks all the blood out, so the person doesn't have any more blood. And sometimes he eats the body, too.
When you're exposed to all of the supernaturalism in the Catholic faith, it's just one step forward to the other side.
Spirits haunt houses sometimes. They follow people around and then enter with the people. So I'm going to prepare a solution to cleanse the house, to remove any negativity or evil eyes, evil thoughts, evil tongues, evil minds, witchcraft, any form that would be not good for the people here. So I'm going to prepare the wash with some ammonia. This is called cascarilla, which is made from holy water. And we also call it a peace powder. We always use rum. The blessing of God, the blessing of God, and angel. It's the blessing of God and blessing of my guardian angel, blessing of the guardian angel of all the people here, with the blessings of Rimalino, with the blessing of Satarayo, with the blessing of Temlatera, blessing of Mamachola, blessing of Mariagua, blessing of Saravana, blessing of Lutecito, blessing of all the 7 African powers. Campala Luisa se rompió, yo manda mi ganga compone, ofico forido, vi medio, onde viva. Mariagua, vivo yo, Campala Luisa se rompió, yo manda mi ganga compone.
In New Orleans, we grew up with a strange mixture of Irish Catholicism, mysticism, and some very powerful voodoo.
You had 2 faces. A lady with long hair and a man with a mustache, Joanne.
And this is going to remove them out of here?
They're going already.
Okay.
The vampire pressed his right fingers against my lips and said, "Be still. I am going to drain you now to the very threshold of death, and I want you to be quiet. So quiet you can hear the flow of blood through your veins. So quiet that you can hear the flow of that same blood through mine." He held my entire prone body in check, and as soon as I stopped my abortive attempt at rebellion, he sank his teeth into my neck.
When I was a child, I was very intensely religious. I remember dressing up as a little angel and walking in a procession with all these other little 6-year-olds. We had these impossible wings strapped to our back. I mean, really agonizing kind of a device. And we came down the aisle, and there were so many flowers that the perfume was just thick in the air for blocks around the church, just thick.
Candles burned in the upstairs parlor. An oil lantern swayed in the breeze on the gallery. All of this light coalesced and began to shimmer as though a golden presence hovered above me, suspended in the stairwell.
This is St. Alphonsus Church. It's the Irish church. The wives of the Irish stonemasons who built it carried the bricks for this structure, 1 brick at a time, from the brickyards in the neighborhood.
It was always sort of a sensuous drench, an experience of flowers and incense and music and beautiful, beautiful windows to look at. I used to, for hours, study these windows. Just look at the different figures and you know, think about different things that had to do, like there's the child Jesus preaching in the temple. That was one of my favorite windows.
"Listen, keep your eyes wide," the vampire whispered to me, his lips moving against my neck. I remember that the movement of his lips raised the hair all over my body, sent a shock of sensation through my body that was not unlike the pleasure of passion.
When I was about 13 or 14 years old, I was an altar boy in this church, and I can recall one evening in the summer following the Tuesday novena, I was asked by the priest to come out and lock up the church, and I can remember passing this pew here and seeing Anne sitting in it, saying her rosary. She was almost in a state of trance.
I fell in love with the saints. I wanted to be a mystic like Rose de Lima. She could take roses and pitch them in the air, and they'd stay in the form of a cross floating in the air. I thought that was wonderful. And she wore a chain around her waist. I remember I wanted to get a chain and wear it around my waist. And she had an oratory, a little place in the backyard where she spent all her time praying. My oratory was right out here. It was right off the back porch. I'd go right outside and pray fanatically. There were moments of almost mystical, union, and you think a great deal about the blood, the pain, the hurt, the wounds.
You know, sometimes the rougarou, besides being anyone, you know, it can take the form of another animal. One night when it was a full moon, this fellow was gonna go hunting. And his grandma told him, said, don't go out hunting when there's a full moon. Well, he went anyway, and he didn't see anything. When he got back to the house, well, he didn't shoot anything, so he saw this owl on top of the house. So he wanted to shoot something, so he killed the owl. When he shot the owl screamed just like a human. And it scared him so much he dropped his gun. He ran inside. When he ran inside, his grandma was slumped over her rocking chair. And she was hollering. She said, I told you not to go hunt in the full moon. And I told you never to shoot an owl. And then his grandma died.
I had a nightmare that the house would catch on fire, and my mother would be drinking, and I wouldn't be able to get my little sisters out. It was a terrible, terrible nightmare. I must have been about 10 or 11 years old, and I remember being so upset about this that I went to bed and just sort of laid there and cried for days on end. And people would try to reason with me and comfort me and talk about how safe the house was and how it wasn't very likely.
It was obvious that my mother was staying drunk, at least 3 to 6 months out of the year. She didn't drink and be, you know, a little fuzzy sometimes. Catherine drank herself into a stupor and stayed that way for months.
But she was very much of a ladylike and closet sort of drinker. She would drink at night alone. And I never recall her seeing her drinking with anyone else. She would drink alone, and then she'd just be asleep in the day when you came in her room. She'd just be unconscious, like Sleeping Beauty. She would just lie there, you know, comatose practically. We were lying on the bed together, and she asked me to say the rosary with her. And she said that this alcohol was like a craving in the blood, that her father had had it, and then she had it. And I remember she was very frightened.
And of course, her liver was gone, I understand. I didn't know it at the time, but she wouldn't stop bleeding, and they had to take her to the hospital and have her sewn up. Well, she sobered up for a little while, and then she went on another tube.
She wouldn't eat. They tried to get her to eat, and she wouldn't eat. And one day she said that she would love to have a glass of beer. And the doctor said, if she wants a glass of beer, give it to her. It can't hurt her at this stage. So that was the last thing that she ingested. And it was early the next morning that she died in my mother's arms.
I think at the funeral, which was not very large and was not very well attended, as I recall, the children were more or less known. Anne, I think, just stood there and watched everything. She became, I think, that day more of a spectator than anything else.
Yes, there it is. Right there. A canal. That's it. It's a comfort to know it's undisturbed.
She would blame us for not being geniuses, that it was my fault and perhaps Ann's fault that she died the way she died because we disappointed her so terribly much.
I felt his teeth withdraw with such a keenness that the 2 puncture wounds seemed enormous, lined with pain. And now he bent over my helpless head, and taking his right hand off me, bit his own wrist. The blood flowed down my shirt and coat, and he watched it with a narrow, gleaming eye. He pressed his bleeding wrist to my mouth, said firmly, a little impatiently, "Louis, drink." I drank, sucking the blood out of the holes, experiencing for the first time since infancy the special pleasure of sucking nourishment. I saw nothing but that light then as I drew blood. And then I saw as a vampire. It was as if I had only just been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. My body began to ache. All my human fluids were being forced out of me. I was dying as a human, yet completely alive as a vampire.
I'm Bob Marcus. I had my first paranormal experience in my mid-40s, observing apparitions. It was very shocking, needless to say. The impressions of Destrehan are that spirits do exist here, and they're here for a purpose, to convey a message, to establish their reality, to prove the existence of life beyond physical death as we understand it.
What are you receiving right now?
I'm receiving that there's an impression, was the plantation in that direction? I hear like the singing of slaves in French dialect. Was the planting done back in that area?
Yes,
okay.
The slave cabins were over about 100 yards
yes,
upriver
very
from
loud,
the house.
Happy singing. I think there's something up there. I feel a presence in the rear of the attic. I sense this presence of the small blonde girl watching out the window overhead. Very placid, round-faced girl. Her hands are on the window pane. She vanished. She was there momentarily.
I left New Orleans when I was almost 16, and I said goodbye to a really Gothic, atmospheric sort of childhood and discovered America sort of in the suburbs of Texas where I went to high school.
Well, I first laid eyes on her in our journalism class when I was a junior in high school. And I immediately noticed that she was extremely bright, vivacious person.
He had a baby face, but he was very tall, and I thought, you know, who in the heck can that be? And at one point, he got up from his table, came back and sat down right next to me and said, I'm tired of being alone up there by myself. And he was very self-assured, and I fell in love with him at that second.
I spent my senior year with another senior class member, dating her. Bad mistake.
I had to leave Texas. I had to go out to San Francisco, really because I had to be self-supporting, and I needed to be in a city like San Francisco where you could go to night school and work at an office job in the day.
Oh, my heart dropped out of my body. And then I knew how much it meant to me. So I found out where she was, and I wrote her a letter.
And it was a wonderful romantic letter, confessing very strong feelings and real distress that I had disappeared to California. And we began a very, very hot correspondence love affair.
And then she came back to Texas in September, and we got married. So basically, over the course of about the last 2 years before we got married, we actually saw each other about 8 days.
The flower children thing sort of happened, the hippie revolution, and we were right in the middle of that. We were living in Haight-Ashbury, and it happened around us. And I'll never forget how strange it was one day to walk out on the street and see a few kids with long hair asking you if you had any spare nickels. And then by the end of the summer, to see that the entire world had descended on the Haight-Ashbury.
Stan was the star. He was already a successful young poet, increasingly well-known in San Francisco literary circles, and was, I think, in the eyes of a lot of people, a lot of their friends, of Stan's friends. She was almost the little wife back typing in the back bedroom.
I don't think there'd ever been any doubt in my mind or Stan's mind that we wanted to have children. And at that time, Stan had just started to teach at San Francisco State, and we thought it was the time to do it. And almost right away, I was pregnant with Michelle, so it went rather perfectly.
She was, I think, the most beautiful child I ever saw. And she was precocious and witty and all of those things that are sometimes said about bright children, but she was really an extraordinary child.
One day we were walking on the Berkeley campus, and Michelle was in the stroller, and we were walking together and talking about literature and books and things like this. And I remember Ann just stopped and looked up and said, "Oh, being here with you and Mouse," because that was what they called her. "Being here with you and Mouse, I'm so happy. I've never been so happy."
Am I damned? Am I from the devil? I was asking myself over and over. What have I become in becoming a vampire? And all the while my thirst grew hotter. My veins were veritable threads of pain in my flesh. My temples throbbed, and finally I could stand it no longer. I stood in an empty, desolate street and heard the sound of a child crying.
Randon, 4836. Kathleen Randon, 4836.
Increase in number. So you can imagine in the blood, instead of having 5,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeters, you have 1,000,000 white blood cells. And the blood that flows to the brain is stopped. It gets clogged. They get damage to the brain, damage to the liver. And as I said, these cells are non-functional. So they can't fight infection. They can't stop from bleeding. It's in a way you eat up your own normal cells.
Well, I knew it before I got the diagnosis. I decided I knew what was wrong with her. The night before we went to the doctor, I told Ann, I think she's got leukemia. You think you're walking on solid ground, you're running along and you have a beautiful life, and it turns out that it's not an oak floor, it's the thinnest possible ice, and you go through and you fall and you fall and you fall and you fall.
She was only 5 at most and very thin, and her face was stained with dirt and tears. She sat in a dark room beside a dead woman, a woman who'd been dead for days. She begged me to help. She began to shake her mother now and to cry in the most pathetic and desperate way.
Stan and Michelle met me at the plane. She'd grown some in that time, so that's my first impression was, of course, she'd simply grown up a bit. Her cheeks were kind of puffy and round a little bit, but maybe no more than a child, not necessarily the obvious effects of the chemotherapy, but she was wearing a little knit hat. And we were walking from the gate, the terminal, into the baggage claim area, and Stan and I were talking, and she was kind of swinging along and carrying on a kind of little conversation of her own. And about the time we got to the baggage area, she suddenly said, whipped off his hat and said, "Look, I'm bald." And said it with this big grin, and there are no words for that moment.
What can you say? There were splendid aspects to it. There were precious moments. We were privileged to possess something that beautiful that meant that much. There was a thrilling quality to that.
I felt, yes, damned, and this is hell. And in that instant, I had bent down and driven hard into the soft, small neck, and hearing her tiny cry, whispered, even as I felt the hot blood on my lips, "It's only for a moment, and there'll be no more pain." I heard her heart in that terrible rhythm, and such a heart. Not the heart of a man or an animal, but the rapid, tenacious heart of a child, beating harder and harder, refusing to die, beating like a tiny fist beating on a door, crying, "I will not die, I will not die, I cannot die, I cannot die."
I don't think Ann wanted to go on living. You know, she got Guillain-Barré syndrome, and I think she tried to die. And a lot of people with Guillain-Barré, a fair number of them die, you know, of respiratory failure. I think in a way Ann did die. when Michelle died.
Anne and Stan were in very bad shape when they came back. They brought Michelle back up to Oakland, and the funeral was in Oakland, and she was buried there in the hills. For weeks after Michelle died, Anne and Stan just sat on the patio and drank wine and drank beer.
Well, if it happened in the 70s, I don't remember it. I can say that pretty clearly. Then we became really Scott and Zelda around our house. I don't think any of our friends thought we'd be alive right now, frankly. It was severe.
I can still remember that as such a happy period of drinking all the time. There was nothing like it, like drinking all night and then walking out on the patio as the sun came up and watching the sun come up and being very, very drunk and eating potato chips and eating fried eggs and then getting drunk all over again. Oh, it was a wonderful period. It was awful, really. You know, I think alcohol betrays you very, very fast as a drug. I mean, the days of wine and roses are really brief. You know, very quickly you're into sickness and gastrointestinal pain and nightmares and inability to sleep, and you pass out, but you sleep for 2 hours and then you're up again. And that hadn't quite set in yet. I can remember just sort of a giving in to drinking in an extreme way. I really didn't care what happened, and I did love the taste of beer.
So Mouse had been dead for 3 years. We were drinking at our heaviest. And she seemed to be in a very hyped state. She would come out of the room and say that she was working on this vampire story. All night. For weeks. The lights were all on. She was going away on the typewriter. I fell asleep. So finally she finished it, and she brought it in for me to read. I read it approximately one sitting, one day. And when I turned the page over, the last page over, just like lights at Times Square going across the board, I just saw the words, "Our life will never be the same." It's absolutely, my life would never be the same. And it never was.
And now in this strange vampire nature, I felt a profound sadness. But I did not brood over this. Rather, I looked around me at all the mortals that I knew and saw all life as precious, condemning all fruitless guilt and passion that would let it slip through the fingers like sand.
Someone had made some crack about someone who had a dead family member. The teacher said, you shouldn't make cracks about that because certain people in here have had dead family members who have died, and so-and-so had an uncle who died, and Chris had a sister who died. I went, what? And her face went blank. And I remember saying, and I remember saying twice, I certainly did not, I certainly did not. And she took me out in the hall and told me that I did.
Life seems at times to me to be just almost unbearable. Just almost unbearable. It's just 1 inch from horrible. The amount of pain, the amount of waste, the amount of loss, the amount of destruction, the chaos, everything. And I think that that's like a vision that's always right near me. And I write, and I see my family, and I follow my obsessions, and I explore what I have to explore to fight that.
When I met her, she had a fantasy life that she'd had since she was a little girl. She would keep a narrative going at all times. And when I would walk in the room and I would see a certain expression on her face, I knew she was in her dream world. She tells me that dream world is starting to die out, incidentally.
How many vampires, do you think, have the stamina for immortality? They have the most dismal notions of immortality to begin with. For in becoming immortal, they want all the forms of their life to be fixed as they are and incorruptible, when in fact all things change except the vampire himself. Soon, with an inflexible mind, this immortality becomes a penitential sentence in a madhouse of figures and forms that are hopelessly unintelligible and without value. One evening, a vampire rises and realizes what he has feared perhaps for decades, that he simply wants no more of life at any cost, and that vampire goes out to die.
A spooky, sleepy soundscape snoozed to BBC Sounds with the Halloween special of 9 tracks.